Hello, everybody. This is Minden Segít podcast, and we are here in the World Adaptation Forum of 2025. And I'm happy to be sitting here with Derrick Jensen. Derrick is an eco-philosopher, writer, and co-founder of the Deep Green Resistance movement. He's an activist. He has been named among the 50 visionaries who are changing the world, and he has been called the poet-philosopher of the ecology movement. Jensen is the author of more than 20 books, including Endgame Volumes 1 and 2, The Culture of Make-Believe, The Myth of Human Supremacy. Was that good?
That's great.
All right, that's sufficient good. Well, I have a question for you. What do you think, if you would have to say one thing that's the biggest challenge right now for human societies and human civilization, what would that be?
I think that we failed to recognize that we have grossly overshot all sorts of planetary limits. And as a doctor friend of mine often says, the first step toward, or correct diagnosis is the first step toward proper treatment. And if we can't acknowledge our circumstances, we can't act appropriately. So I'd say the biggest problem is a complete failure to acknowledge that the earth was not simply created for humans and especially for machines, but instead that, and also a complete failure to recognize that we are effectively killing the planet.
But what makes us fail recognizing such a thing?
Are you asking why do we not recognize, or are you asking why it's important that we don't recognize? What is the importance of not recognizing?
No, well, I would like to know both, but first I would ask, why do we not recognize this?
I think there are a bunch of reasons. On the most basic is Lewis Mumford, about 60 some years ago, wrote about why it is that, and things were not as bad then as they are now. And he wrote about how it is that we can collectively not face the circumstances that we're facing. And his answer was what he called a magnificent bribe, that we have access to luxuries that were undreamed of. So we are sitting right here in a palace. Mm-hmm. And you and I, and everyone listening to this, has access to greater luxuries than the people who built this palace. We have access to instantaneous communication, near instantaneous travel. Very recently, I live literally across the world, 10 time zones away? And I traveled from the west coast of North America to Ireland in 10 and a half hours. Mm-hmm. And that would have been unthinkable in that time. We have access to all of these luxuries. We have access to modern medicine. We have access to hot showers. We have access to all sorts of things that give us all good reason to not think about the effects of where they came from. We live in a city, and then we don't ask, where does the food come from? How was the electricity made? Where do the metals come from? What was involved? Whose home was destroyed so that those metals, non-human homes. When I first saw the Danube last night, my first feeling was of tremendous sorrow, because this is not the river it was 3,000 years ago. And the non-human inhabitants, their homes have been destroyed. And this is so we have a very good reason not to pay attention, which is that we derive great benefit from it. But then there's a whole series of other levels we could talk about. And since this is fairly short, I'll just get to one of them right now, which is R.D. Laing, the psychiatrist, talked about the 3 rules of a dysfunctional family, like a family with an alcoholic or run by an alcoholic or with a batterer. He said, rule A is don't. Rule A1 is rule A does not exist. And rule A2 is never discuss the existence or non-existence rules A1, or A2. So within some sort of dysfunctional system, we can talk about anything we want except for the violence that we have to pretend isn't happening. Mm-hmm. And it's the same on the larger level. We can talk about anything we want except for the corporations that are running everything, or the fact that this is inherently unsustainable, or we can't talk about the fact that there are too many people, or the fact that there's too much technology. The technosphere, which is everything we've created, from concrete to this table to these microphones. The technosphere at this point, all human creations, outweighs the biosphere by 7 times. All of human creations are 7 times larger than the biosphere, the mass of the biosphere. And then one last thing is that I want for listeners to think about, or people watching this to think about. So I had this terrible realization one day many years ago when I realized that I touch plastic more than I touch flesh. And I want people to think about how many of your sensory perceptions are created or mediated by humans and or machines, and how many of them are created by non-humans. And if all you ever hear are the voices of humans mediated by machines, you can come to believe that they're the only ones who exist. And there's an entire world. I heard this interview with an astronomer decades ago in which somebody asked him, why do we need to go to Mars? And he said, to answer that most important question of all, which is, are we all alone? I was like, how can you ask that question when we're surrounded by this beautiful, extraordinary world filled with all of these non-human sentiences? Where I live, I see bears. I see 5 or 6 bears every single day, and they're individual bears. I mean, they're also bears. I'm not saying that they're humans. They're bears, and they are like, we all know that if we have a dog, that dog is its own being, and it's the same with every single non-human we see. It's its own being, with a life as valuable to it as mine is to me and yours is to you. And so we can't. This way of life would collapse. Well, it's going to collapse anyway, but it would collapse immediately and consciously if we recognized that what we're doing to everyone else. But so we can't face that. So that's one of the reasons we don't pay attention. Also, we want the party to go on as long as it can. We're having fun at the party, more or less. Never mind the fact that this party has tremendous expenses. Why do drug addicts keep taking the drugs they know are killing them? And in this case, it's more difficult because we all hear that addicts don't change until they hit rock bottom. The problem is we're not hitting rock bottom. Everybody else is. And that's one reason we don't face it.
Do you think if, they say to be a true skeptic, it requires an open mind. And sometimes I feel that it's hard to talk about consciousness and what is life at all with mainstream scientists. And sometimes I get the idea that if we'd focus more on discovering things that we can't see or maybe can't measure yet as accurately as we would like to acknowledge it as hard science, maybe we would, gain a lot if our cultural or spiritual evolution would catch up a little bit to our technological evolution. Maybe that would serve humanity in a much greater way than the current technological evolution does. And I would like to know your opinion about this. Do we know enough or anything at all about consciousness and the levels and types of it and what life is?
Part of the problem is that our entire worldview is based on how you perceive the world affects how you behave in the world. How I perceive you affects how I behave towards you. And part of the problem is that we are trained from our earliest days to perceive the world as consisting of resources to be exploited as other beings to enter into relationship with. The notion of plants being sentient and having a lives that are valuable to them is laughable to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems that science is sort of running into, somebody said this to me 30 years ago, that the means, the ability of science to measure things is soon going to undercut many of the fundamental assumptions of science. So as we have machines that are increasingly capable, so Stefano Mancuso studies plant language and plant sentience. He's an Italian scientist, and he's been able to start a dictionary of a plant that they will communicate through, for example, sending out chemical messages. Mm-hmm. And they will, if they're getting chewed on by a certain caterpillar, they might send off a message to other plants saying, change the composition of your leaves because there are these caterpillars around and you want to make yourself inedible to them. And 100 years ago, scientists couldn't have measured those chemicals. And now scientists can. He has so far a dictionary of like 1,400 words or phrases that are used between plants.
Crazy.
But that's undercutting that basis of the idea that that plants aren't sentient. Mm-hmm. We can't ignore that much longer. So that's one part of the answer I want to give is that yes, science is based on some fundamental assumptions that humans are the actors and the world is acted upon. And many of those assumptions won't hold up under the measurements that science is capable of. But let's leave that aside for a moment and let's just go with straight, let's pretend that all the scientific stuff is straight on. We can just go with those numbers to recognize how humans are overpopulated, how we are over-technologized, how we are destroying. We can. At one point, they couldn't have really measured. They wouldn't have means to determine, how many blue whales there are in the ocean. They can increasingly measure that, and it's all bad. So no matter whether we have a revolution of consciousness or whether we just acknowledge that the world, it doesn't really matter if there's a sense in which no matter whether you're looking at this from a consciousness perspective or from a straight scientific perspective, this way of living won't last. It doesn't take a cognitive giant to figure out that if you have uncountable salmon and then you can count them and there's 1 million of them and then you can count them and there's 500,000, then 250,000, then 100,000, it doesn't take a genius to figure out where that's heading. And so no matter how you look at it, this way of life won't last. And if I can summarize all of my work into one sentence, it would be that this way of life won't last, and when it's over, I'd rather there's more wild nature left rather than less. And however we get there, I would prefer, every cell in my body wants for us to have this voluntary transformation where we figure out what we're doing wrong and then we start doing things right and we change things around. I don't believe it's going to happen. And I'll tell one quick story about that if that's okay, which is that when I was a kid, I was pretty messy and my mom would say, clean your room, and I wouldn't do it. She would say, clean your room, I wouldn't do it. And then she would say, okay, so either A, you can clean your room, or B, if you don't clean it by dinner, I'm going to clean it. And if I clean it, you're not going to like it because I'm going to throw everything away. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the situation we're facing, is that we can clean up our own room, or if we don't do it, nature's going to do it for us. And we're not going to like it because everything's going to get thrown away.
What makes you really honestly happy?
A couple things. One of them is the fact that I'm alive and I have a body, and that is just a delight. And I'm getting older, and things hurt more as you get older, but it's still just an absolute delight. What a wonderful thing to be alive. That's one thing. And the other thing is just being with non-humans, being with humans too sometimes, but being with non-humans. I mentioned earlier that I see bears all the time, and that makes me happy to see a bear and to see them year after year. And when is this bear going to show up again? When is this bear going to go to sleep in the winter? And to just hang out with, and to get to know trees, to get to know. I've lived on the same land for 25 years now, and it's a long-term relationship, and I get to see some grow up and some die and some fall over, and it just, I mean, hearing the wind in the trees makes me happier. Earlier, just a little while ago, I was hearing thunder, and that makes me really happy. And it made me happy earlier today when there was a little rain squall. Or even though it made me sad to see the Danube, it's just beautiful. And just the beauty of it all just makes me very happy. I sometimes will be walking, like late at night, I'll be walking my dogs for their final pee at night, and I just look up at the skyline of trees and then the stars behind the trees, and I just stop and this isn't fancy. This isn't sort of any sort of fancy philosophy. I'll just stop and go, "What? This is so beautiful."
Thanks, Derrick. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And your questions were a delight.
You're a delight too, man.
Thank you.
See you later.
See you later.